Hi, welcome to the next video. And I'm sure you are back because you found the first set of videos captivating and you're like, I'm ready to go. I want to understand a little bit more of what I can, how I can understand these different sets of formulas for understanding my patterns of disproportionality, as well as other areas of disparities that are existing within our education system. This formula here, just like the other formulas, can be applied to a variety of educational practice areas. Here, I'm going to focus in on special education as my example, but the formula can be applied in other areas. So I'll first start by defining what is relative risk ratio, right? What is it actually sort of telling us? Relative risk ratio as a formula allows for us to be able to determine that based on existing patterns that are occurring within our school system, it allows us to know whether or not one group has a greater or lower risk, or equal risk in relation to all others. And the formula, in the way in which it's organized, allows for us to really do that sort of comparative type of calculation to know the degree of risk that relative risk that a particular group has. Once we do the formula, the numeric value that we arrive at, we have to use a particular standard to or a ruler to know does that number actually mean to us. And the standard ruler that is used is this, right? 1.0, anything close to 1.0 or at 1.0 signals that there's equal risk, right? Meaning that all things being equal, everybody has the same chance of a particular, or that particular group has a similar chance or equitable chance of having a condition occur in relation to everyone else. Anything above 1.0 signals an elevated risk. Anything below 1.0 signals a lowered risk. So what is this formula here? As you can see, the formula is existing on the left side of your screen here, and I'm going to slowly walk you through it so you can understand how to practice this particularized formula. What you will note is, and what I'll do in terms of like a sort of just a broad overview of the formula, is that we're trying to determine a ratio in the numerator position and a ratio in the denominator, right? Those are the two places in which we are trying to define ratios. So let's start with our first ratio that we need to create, right? So first, we always want to start with one subgroup at a time and compare that one subgroup to everybody else. So we'll start with Black students, right? So we'll take Black students with disabilities divided by Black enrollment, right? So the total number of Black students enrolled. So in this particular example, you will see in the second column, you'll see that 528 is reflective of the total number of Black students with disabilities. And that number is divided by 2,594, which is the total number of Black students that are enrolled. And when we do that division, that gives us our first ratio. And you'll see that it's existing in the third column. So the ratio is 0.2035. And we want to just place that there and while we do the ratio for our other set of numbers. So now we have to go and look at the rest of the student population, right? Everyone else except Black students. So here, one of the things that you'll notice as we get to the denominator position, we're going to need to do some, we're going to have to make sure that in this formula, we follow orders of operation. And here, orders of operation, we're going to have to do what's inside the parentheses first, and then we step outside of the parentheses. So the first one is, you'll see it says total students with disabilities minus Black students with disabilities, right? So, because we have to make sure we remove the Black students from the total number of students with disabilities. Otherwise, we are double dipping our numbers. So what that looks like is we take 1272, which is total number of students with disability. We subtract it by 528, which is the Black students with disabilities. And that leaves us with 744, which is the number that you see in the third column. And then we go to our next parentheses, which is the total enrollment minus Black enrollment. Again, we have to remove the Black student population because otherwise we are double dipping our numbers. So here we have 7,036, which is the total enrollment, minus 2,594, which is our Black student enrollment. And that gives us 4,442. Now we're ready to step outside our parentheses and do the calculation within our brackets. And here we have to divide 744 divided by 4,442. And that gives us our second ratio based on that calculation. And that ratio is 0.1674. And as you'll see, I've put all the numbers on the fourth column here. So we have the ratio from our first calculation, which is 0.2035 divided by 0.1674. And when we do that division, that gives us a final relative risk ratio of 1.21. And that is the relative risk ratio of our Black student population. So Black students in this district are 1.2 times more likely compared to all other students to experience being identified with a disability. All right, that's the core of the formula, right? So what does it look like when we put them all together? So here you'll see all the racial ethnic groups and the total number of students enrolled, the students with disabilities, and you'll see the relative risk ratio at the bottom row. And you'll see Native American student population, the relative risk ratio is 0 because there are 0 students that identify as Native American that have been identified with a disability. Our Asian Pacific Islander students, their relative risk ratio is 0.55, and that's below the 1.0 marker, right? So they have a lowered risk. And what we want to note when we describe that lowered risk is we want to describe what is lowered, right? And here for our Asian Pacific Islander students, it's 0.45. That's what's lowered, right? Another way of describing their lowered risk is you can say it in percentage. You can say that Asian Pacific Islander students are 45% less likely compared to all other students to be identified with a disability. We already talked about our Black students. They're 1.2 times more likely, or you can say it in percentage as well. You can say they're 21% more likely compared to all other students. Our Hispanic or Latinx students are 1.1 times more likely, or 11% more likely. Our white students are 1.02. They're right there on that cusp of equal risk, right? And finally, our multiracial student population is 0.84. That's reflective of a lowered risk. So we would note the 0.16 or 16% less likely compared to all other students, right? So here's the relative risk ratio when we look at it with all students' disability categories included. When we look at it by identification categories, we want to do the exact same thing. We want to look at it by those specific set of categories. And here, you'll see here, these are the total numbers of the identification categories of greatest interest, or what we call the high incidence categories. And they're high incidence because of the nature to which they're occurring at the frequent rates across the country, and also because they carry a great deal of subjectivity. We have emotional disturbance, learning disabilities, speech language impairment, and other health impairments. And then when we look at it, we do the exact same formula, and this is what we get in terms of the relative risk ratio. So now, if you remember our Black student example that we had, Black students were 1.21 times more likely, or 21% more likely to be identified with disability. However, when we look at it by specific identification categories, we see that Black students are actually, their relative risk ratios are higher in certain categories. And it's important that as you do this work, you do these set of calculations using the relative risk ratio, is that you practice doing it in these, particularly in these high incidence categories, so we can really tease apart, are there particular set of disability categories that we're seeing particular groups experiencing a higher or lower incidence of. I hope you've enjoyed, and this has helped you really ground you in understanding relative risk ratio, and you have an opportunity to practice it moving forward. Enjoy and happy calculating.